Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Henry Jackson Society on the Human Rights Council. But before I do introductions and so on, and we have our speech and questions, I thought it would be a good idea for us to have 1 minute's silence in memory of Elie Wiesel. So may I invite you to rise and observe 1 minute's silence in blessed memory. Although that was a sad event we just commemorated, in many ways our speaker today could not be more appropriate. And in some ways he is sharing some of the wonderful attributes of Elie Wiesel. Hillel Neuer was once a lawyer in private practice in Canada and the US. I think it's no exaggeration to say that now he is a lawyer for the whole world. He has made a study of the United Nations Human Rights Council. He speaks truth to power. And he hasn't only studied that and defended Israel, he has also defended victims in Darfur and Rwanda and elsewhere in the world where there is genocide and persecution, which tends to be overlooked by the United Nations. But he's also the most devastating critic of the Council. And I recommend to those of you, you can find it on your computers or iPads, his very famous short speech a few years ago, where he told the Council how blind they were to most of the terrible things happening in the world, while focusing on Israel. And to their shame, the Council said, "Oh, we won't listen to this," which tells you more than anything else you need to know about the 10-year-old Human Rights Council. So, without more ado, we will listen to Hillel Neuer, and there will be time at the end for questions, bearing in mind that we have to finish at 1 o'clock. Hillel, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Baroness Deech, for hosting me, and the Henry Jackson Society for organizing this event. I have to say that being here in the House of Lords is one of the highlights of my life. I am Canadian. I grew up in a family of Anglophiles. My late grandmother grew up in a small town in Ontario, very much English country in Guelph, Ontario, and I think were she alive and to see me speaking in the House of Lords, it would be a thrill for her, and so really it's a great honor for me to be here, and especially also that I'm a law student, and so of course we study decisions of the law lords with great interest. So it's really great to be here, and thank you both for providing me with this opportunity to speak with you on the important matter of the performance of the United Nations Human Rights Council here on its 10th anniversary, and on possible options for reform. And we just mentioned the name and the memory of Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel, one of the profound moral voices of our time. And I think with his passing, there is no one that I can think of who can replace his voice. And so the responsibility to be what he was, which was a force for moral action, whether it was against anti-Semitism or against genocide in Rwanda, Bosnia, or Cambodia, I think the responsibility in a tiny way falls upon all of us to continue to speak out with the moral voice that he had and to call for action. And so as I analyze the Human Rights Council, it is for the purpose of action keeping victims in mind. And indeed, just one other word on Elie Wiesel. Yesterday I spoke at a rally near Marble Arch, and I read out loud a tribute that was written by my friend Janine in Geneva. She is a Rwandan who's active in the memory of the Rwandan genocide, and she wrote something on Facebook, and you can find it on the UN Watch Facebook page. And she wrote how she was at the UN Durban II Racism Conference of 2009, which most famously the opening speaker was Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and Elie Wiesel was there with other great figures to speak out against the Holocaust denial that, as expected, President Ahmadinejad expressed on that day, April 20th, 2009. And Janine and her friend Kayetesi Burt, who was a survivor of the Rwandan genocide, they were in that assembly hall hearing Ahmadinejad call to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, off the map. And there was a rule that they closed all the doors for security reasons, and they couldn't leave, and she wanted to leave, and she felt very suffocated. And finally, somehow, Janine and Kaitezi, they were able to walk out, and they were feeling quite traumatized. And then somehow they stumbled upon Elie Wiesel, and Janine wrote how Elie Wiesel took Kaitezi, who was crying, and embraced her and held her hands and her cheek, and what a special moment that was. So I just wanted to share that about Elie Wiesel, and indeed it relates to the issues that I have to discuss today. The occasion upon which we meet is the 10th anniversary of the Human Rights Council, which was established in June of 2006. And in Geneva, we just marked the anniversary with a special gathering of all former presidents of the Council. Every year there's a new president, so all 10 presidents were there, with one on video screen. There were concerts to celebrate the anniversary, and as you crossed over the Pont Mont Blanc, the wonderful bridge overlooking Lake Geneva with the view of the Mont Blanc, there were giant flags celebrating the 10th year of the Council. But we also meet on another anniversary, which is the 70th anniversary that the original body, the predecessor body, the Commission on Human Rights, was established by none other than Eleanor Roosevelt, the great humanitarian of the age, in 1946. She was the founding chair. And with her, the vice chair, René Cassin, who became the architect of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. With them, of course, P.C. Chang from China, Charles Malik of Lebanon, and John Humphrey of Canada, someone whom I had the privilege to see in his older age when he taught at McGill University in my law faculty. So it's been 70 years since the idea of human rights at the United Nations was established. And the reform happened in 2006. The new body is called the Human Rights Council. It is 47 nations. And these two anniversaries make our discussion particularly timely. How has the Council performed, the new and improved Human Rights Council, reformed in 2006, how has it performed in its first decade, and what should the United Kingdom and its allies in the democratic world do to advance the Council's founding goals? I believe we can best measure the Council's performance by the yardstick of the United Nations' own standards. Not my standards, not Amnesty International, but the UN's own standards. These were set forth in 2005 by then Secretary General Kofi Annan. It was February 2005 that my organization, United Nations Watch, was hosting a panel on reform, and only the day before, Kofi Annan released what was a bombshell at the time, his call for reform entitled In Larger Freedom, and in that discussion was a call to scrap the Commission on Human Rights and to create a new body. This really was a bombshell. I remember the Irish ambassador at the time was kind of in shock, and she said it. She doesn't see what was wrong with the Commission. The Commission seemed to be working fine, but that's not what Kofi Annan said. He identified core failings, and these include the following. Number one, at the old Commission, countries had sought membership, quote, not to strengthen human rights, but to protect themselves against criticism or to criticize others. Number two, Kofi Annan said, the Commission on Human Rights had become undermined by the politicization of its sessions and the selectivity of its work. Third, the Commission suffered from, I quote, declining professionalism, he said, and, quote, a credibility deficit which cast a shadow on the reputation of the United Nations as a whole. The words of Kofi Annan. This had never happened before, that the highest official of the United Nations, or frankly any other lower official, had said what many human rights groups had already been saying. And indeed, this was in part because the Commission, over time, had become not a body of Eleanor Roosevelt and René Cassin, but rather of governments, and not only any governments, but paradoxically, absurdly, governments whose only expertise on human rights lay in systematically violating those fundamental freedoms. Sudan was a regular member, China was a regular member. Most famously, the regime of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi was elected and became chair of the Commission on Human Rights in 2003. So 1946, Eleanor Roosevelt, 2003, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. So that I believe was the final straw that prompted Kofi Annan to say the truth, which again other groups had been saying. And he called for a new council. And indeed the General Assembly 1 year later created a new council. And the expectations were set out by the UN. The resolution 60/251 of 2006 promised the new council would elect members who are committed to, quote, uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights. Those who commit gross and systematic violations could have their membership suspended by a 2/3 majority vote. The council would, in its work, quote, address situations of violations of human rights, including gross and systematic violations. There was the powerful tool at the request of only 16 of the 47 members to convene an urgent session, thereby to put a spotlight on urgent situations. Finally, the work of the council would be guided by, quote, universality, impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity. 10 years later, where do we stand? Have these expectations been met? Well, let's look at the first pillar that Kofi Annan pointed to, which I believe underlies everything else, and that is the membership. If you want to create a better soup, you need to have fresh and good ingredients. Kofi Annan called to reform the membership, and indeed the entire work of the council stands or falls, I believe, on the quality of its membership. Sadly, this year, 10 years later, in 2016, 10 years after the reform, the council membership has never been worse. A large majority of the council members, 62%, failed to meet minimal standards of a free democracy as measured by the group Freedom House. Only 38% meet those standards. The members are either not free or partially free, and they include such notable experts on human rights as the Communist Party of China, the Communist regime of Cuba, the Russian regime of Vladimir Putin. Saudi Arabia is a member of the council, as is Venezuela, where people are starving today in Caracas. So too, members include Algeria, Burundi, where there have been warnings of genocide 6 months ago, Congo, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Vietnam. Now, in 2001, speaking of the old commission, Kenneth Roth of Human Rights Watch said this, and I quote, "Imagine a jury that includes murderers and rapists, or a police force run in large part by suspected murderers and rapists who are determined to stymie investigation of their crimes." Sadly, 10 years after the reform, these words apply even more today. Not surprisingly, with the membership that I just described, apart from a small number of exceptions, there have been resolutions on varying strength, and we welcome them, on North Korea, on Syria, on Iran, on Eritrea. But these are a small number of exceptions. For the most part, for the large majority, the Council has turned a blind eye to the world's worst human rights violations. It has failed the victims most in need of international attention. There have been no resolutions for victims in China. Our group brought Jigme Golog, a Tibetan Buddhist monk who was tortured in China for the crime of creating a video documenting abuses against his people. There has never been a resolution for 1.3 billion people who are denied systematically freedom of speech, the prohibition against torture, and so forth. No resolution. No resolution on Cuba, where peaceful civic activists are beaten or languish in prison. None for Zimbabwe, despite ongoing brutality. And despite the promise of the urgent sessions, which I mentioned, which can be convened by only 16 countries, there has never been an emergency session on Iran, even as it was slaughtering its own people in June 2009 when they cried out against the fraudulent elections. There was no emergency session over the past year or so as Saudi Arabia has carpet-bombed Yemen, killing hundreds of children without making any attempt at distinctions, even as the regime has continued to offer an example and inspiration for Islamic State in that Saudi Arabia is beheading more people than ever before, subjugates women, tramples religious freedom, and continues all of this in the name of a fundamentalist theology which over decades and with billions of petrodollars Saudi Arabia has propagated around the globe. Now, on the contrary, not only is Saudi Arabia a member of the Council, not only last year was it chosen to head the committee, which many of you may have heard of, head the committee that selects human rights experts, and that includes when they selected the expert on women's rights, and when they selected the expert on the independence of judiciary. Saudi Arabia, which has Raif Badawi, the blogger, in prison under a 10-year sentence, 1,000 lashes, 50 of which he has received, it was chosen twice last year to be on that committee. And it's worse than that. And now I take you from Geneva to New York. As you may know, in New York, just a few weeks ago, Saudi Arabia was listed on 2 pages on the report, the annual report of countries that are responsible for the deaths of children in armed conflict. The report noted that Saudi Arabia's coalition, which is bombing Yemen, has killed hundreds of children. 60% or more of the casualties are due to the Saudi coalition. The report was published. Saudi Arabia called Ban Ki-moon, and they said, if you don't delete those 2 pages from a report that is already published, we will do the following. Number one, we will cut our $100 million donation to UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinians. We will cut that money if you mention what we do in Yemen. And their allies called and said they will also cut their money. Some of the Gulf countries give another $50 million to the same agency. What is more, quoted by Reuters, which said that Saudi Arabia and its allies, what they did was pure blackmail. Saudi Arabia and its allies said that if their name would not be deleted from the report, there would convene a group of Islamic clerics in Saudi Arabia. They would issue a fatwa against the United Nations and say that it is anti-Islamic. This is in the Reuters report, and in the speech that I gave at the Human Rights Council last week, I read it out. The Saudi ambassador was not very happy. But this happened, and Ban Ki-moon, to his shame, caved. And he deleted 2 pages of a report that are already published. Again, not a report that was going to be published, already published. And he said it was a very difficult decision, but he had no choice because of all the money going to programs. So we now know that UNRWA, which has a noble mandate to help Palestinians, but too often abuses that mandate with teachers that very often post Facebook posts with pictures of Hitler. And in this country, when a teacher did that, he was fired by the educational system. He was fired. And UNRWA denied everything. And when groups such as ours showed proof after proof, finally they said we suspended some people. Who they suspended for how long, we don't know. But UNRWA continues to do what it does with $150 million of Saudi money so that Saudi Arabia has immunity from the UN to continue bombing children in Yemen. But coming back to the Human Rights Council. In total, according to our calculations, 179 out of 193 UN member states have never been condemned by the Human Rights Council, nor have they been made the subject of a commission of inquiry or investigation by a special rapporteur or of an urgent session. Most troubling, in my opinion, is that no resolutions have even been proposed on these countries. In other words, it's one thing if the UK, the US, and the Netherlands would propose a resolution and be shot down by the majority that I described, but they're not even being proposed. What is notable, because it's the measure, when people measure the Council, they measure where we are today to where we were in the first year of the Council. That is not a meaningful measure. The Council was supposed to replace and improve upon the widely discredited Commission on Human Rights. And so we need to compare with the Commission. Now, the Commission on Human Rights in a 10-year period, from 91 to 2001, condemned 24 different countries. And nevertheless, it was considered discredited. In the past 10 years, the Human Rights Council has only condemned 14 different countries. So on this issue, the minority faction of liberal democracies, France, Germany, UK, the US, which this year is not a member, but will be a member next year, we the democracies cannot blame others. We are not introducing resolutions. This is wrong. Let me mention one mechanism of the new and improved Council which is often invoked, and that is called Universal Periodic Review, known as UPR. This was the big innovation of the new Council. In the old Commission, if there was no resolution introduced to turn a spotlight on a country, it would never be addressed at all. Under the new UPR, Universal Periodic Review, every country must be reviewed at least once over a 4 or 5 year period. In theory, that is a welcome development. Every country, China, Saudi Arabia, will get reviewed once. Maybe only every 5 years. Maybe only it's 1 day. It's only 3 hours. And maybe those doing the reviews are not experts or objective people, but actually other governments. But the idea is welcome. And we welcome that innovation. And I think there have been the democracies, some of them have used that occasion when China was reviewed to ask meaningful questions. They only get a minute or two, but they've asked specific concrete questions to hold China or Saudi Arabia or Cuba to account. And again, that is welcome. And it provides a hook for NGOs like ours to bring victims on that day outside the Council for a press conference, and so it creates a brief spotlight. And so the mechanism is welcome. However, those who invoke it too often fail to mention how it is abused by the worst regimes. And I'll give you an example. During one session in 2009, Libya used the UPR to praise Cuba for promoting freedom of thought and expression, while China praised Saudi Arabia for its record on women's rights. In 2013, China again used the UPR to praise Saudi Arabia for its religious tolerance, days after 53 Ethiopian Christians were arrested for praying in a private home in Saudi Arabia. So China praised Saudi Arabia. The next day, when it was China being reviewed, Saudi Arabia took the floor, and they praised China for its, quote, progress in ethnic minority regions at the political, cultural, and educational levels, even as Tibetans have their human rights trampled and their Buddhist monks are beaten. So it's indeed has become the UPR, to a large degree, with some exceptions, what we described in a 125-page report, a mutual praise society. Again, the idea that every country gets reviewed once every 5 years is welcome, but too often it's not being used properly. Let me just mention a few other issues with the Council, and then go to options for reform, and then wrap up. One of the problems of the Human Rights Council is that when it fails to do its job properly, it abuses a vital educational instrument. Resolutions of the United Nations, whether we like it or not, are translated into every official language, circulated around the globe, and the Human Rights Council has become the temple of human rights for the human rights movement, which makes its pilgrimage 3 times a year in September, March, and June to sessions of the Council. And it is the focal point for the human rights discussion at the intergovernmental level. And of course, the United Nations is the single most significant repository of international legitimacy. And so when human rights concepts are distorted, that causes damage which can last generations. And I'll mention one, something that I spoke on last week inside the Council. We heard from the expert on racism and xenophobia. I think possibly no issue has been more distorted at the United Nations and at the Human Rights Council than the discussion on racism. Today, if we want to think of an example of victims who are most hurt by xenophobia, I think the example that comes to mind are the Yazidi women who are kidnapped, some 3,000 Yazidi women from Iraq, now many of them in Syria, and are being used as sex slaves. It's almost impossible to really imagine and believe that in 2016, thousands of women have been kidnapped and are being sold on the markets as sex slaves. And yet it is happening. And 2 weeks ago, we brought Yazidi member of parliament in Iraq, Vian Dakhil, to testify before the Council about this. Now, the New York Times did a lengthy article a year or so ago about the theology of rape. ISIS didn't just kidnap women and rape them. There's a whole theology which they developed, in which the Islamic State terrorist, before he rapes a 13-year-old woman, and the New York Times documented this, told her how what he was doing was commanded by his understanding of Sharia. This was a theology of rape that was developed in this fanatical movement. And it's a theology of hatred against the Yazidis because they are non-believers. This is, I think, the ultimate example I can think of xenophobia and hatred. And yet, in the 12 years that I've been at the UN, I've never heard of this ideology, which didn't begin yesterday. It was developed by extremist Wahhabist ideas, which was the fertile ground in which ISIS developed, and perhaps made things more extreme or implemented things. But the ideas were there. And yet the racism effort at the Human Rights Council, all the experts, never mentioned these victims or this ideology at all. They missed it. They missed it. Instead, much of the discussion is on the West. And this report on xenophobia worldwide talked about xenophobia here in the West and neo-Nazi movements and so forth. Now, I think it's very important that we talk about all xenophobic movements around the world. And there are xenophobic movements in the West. And there is populism. And it is being abused by bigots, whether it's in America or here in Western Europe, and where I live in Switzerland. And absolutely that's happening. We need to talk about it. But for the UN to have a narrative which is only about, the narrative basically is that white people in the West are abusing people of color and Muslims, and that is the narrative. And again, when it's true, we need to talk about it and fight it, and I welcome that. But the narrative has to be expanded a little bit, that if little girls in Nigeria are being kidnapped by Boko Haram because they're Christians, because they're non-Muslims, and people around the world are being killed, that doesn't fit that narrative, where it's slaves in Mauritania, where there may be, according to The Guardian, hundreds of thousands of slaves in Mauritania. That is never talked about in this UN racism machinery. So I think that the Human Rights Council has a very distorted anti-Western, anti-colonial narrative. There are many resolutions that are introduced and adopted by Cuba that are anti-capitalist, that say that human rights abuses around the world are due to banks and so forth. And their model, I would say, would be the regime of Hugo Chavez, which today people are starving in Caracas. I'll mention a word or two about Israel. I think everybody knows that I mentioned all the countries that are ignored. Let us consider where the Council is active. Despite the promise of ending selectivity, and indeed Kofi Annan pointed to as the classic example of selectivity, was how at the old Human Rights Commission, Israel was targeted in the special agenda item and in a disproportionate amount of resolutions. Yet despite the promise of non-selectivity, the Council's pathological obsession with demonizing Israelis, it's not the state of Israel, it's Israelis, and denying their human rights has never been worse. Since its creation, the Council has adopted 67 resolutions condemning one country, Israel, and only 61 on the rest of the world combined. So there have been 6 more resolutions on Israel than the entire rest of the world combined. The resolutions on Israel are uniquely suffused with political hyperbole, selective reporting, and the suppression of any countervailing facts that might provide balance in background information or context. Its commissions of inquiry, like the Goldstone Report, which exonerated Hamas, initiated a new era whereby a terrorist group has come to rely on the UN Human Rights Council as an international tool in its war against Israel. Knowing that the Council will automatically condemn Israel based on a false, effects-based evaluation of targeting judgments, Hamas has been incentivized by the UN to launch more and more rocket attacks against Israeli civilians while placing its own civilian population in harm's way. And just now in March, the Council instituted a new UN blacklist of companies doing business across the 1949 armistice line to have the UN effectively implement the anti-Israeli BDS campaign, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. By legitimizing coercive measures akin to the Arab boycott of Israel, the Council now seeks to strangle the economic life of Israeli citizens. Finally, let us consider the experts of the Council, because the Council is not only the product of decisions by governments. There are some 70 experts under 50 different mandates known as special rapporteurs or independent experts or working groups. A number of them do important work, including one who lives in this country, Dr. Ahmed Shaid, the expert on Iran. He does very good work. But far too many are, in effect, wolves in sheep's clothing, appointed by the dictatorships to pursue radical agendas in the name of human rights. And I'll mention just a few. In 2008, they appointed Richard Falk, a leading promoter of the 9/11 conspiracy theory and a supporter of Hamas. And I take a moment to applaud your government, the UK government, which during Richard Falk's 6-year mandate, they condemned him 3 times for anti-Semitism. I believe he was the only UN expert ever been condemned for anti-Semitism, and your government did so 3 times, and I applaud them for that. I also applaud Susan Rice, who's now the National Security Advisor in Washington, for condemning his poisonous words when she was ambassador to the UN. Richard Falk, as UN expert, was a leading supporter of the 9/11 conspiracy theory, a supporter of Hamas, a supporter of Ahmadinejad, and of course in 1979 he had written the infamous op-ed in the New York Times called Trusting Khomeini, in which he welcomed the new regime of Ayatollah Khomeini, which he said would be a new model of democracy for the world. So he was a UN expert for 6 years. By the way, he was so pro-Hamas that the Palestinian Authority, which named him there, effectively, they put him there, they didn't know what to do with him because they despised Hamas. So they actually, according to WikiLeaks, we learned that even as they were praising Richard Falk publicly, privately in WikiLeaks, we know that the Palestinians urged the Americans to try to get rid of Falk, and that they asked Falk to resign, and that he wouldn't quit, and they asked the Americans to help him. The Americans said, it's not nice to fire UN experts, we can't help you. So this is what was happening below ground. I'll mention two other experts. In 2014, when Richard Falk's term was up, the Council went ahead and appointed his wife and colleague, Hillel Neuer, who, as the US and Canada objected, espouses equally toxic and inflammatory views. Another expert of the Council, perhaps the longest-serving expert, he's been there, I think, 16 years, is a man named Jean Ziegler. He was the expert on hunger. He is someone who was appointed by the Cuban government, nominated at one point by Chavez. He is a Swiss radical left-wing ideologue who, in 1989, created the Muammar Gaddafi Human Rights Prize. I'll say that one more time. The Muammar Gaddafi Human Rights Prize, created in 1989, gives out $250,000 a year until it ended with his death in 2011. The prize went to Fidel Castro in 1 year. In 1 year, the Gaddafi Prize went to Hugo Chavez. In 1 year, to Louis Farrakhan, head of the largest anti-Semitic group in the United States. In 2002, the prize was given to Roger Garaudy, a convicted French Holocaust denier, and in that same year to Jean Ziegler himself. I couldn't make this up if I wanted to. He is a UN expert. He sits now on the advisory committee of the Human Rights Council. And not surprisingly, he defends Iran, says that Iran is a victim of Western sanctions. Last year, the Council made Idriss Jazayeri, a former Algerian diplomat, as one of its human rights experts, even though Ambassador Jazayeri most famously led an aggressive campaign, when he was Algeria's ambassador, to muzzle the independent experts. He is now one of the independent experts, who, of course, went to Sudan several months ago and said Sudan, too, was a victim of human rights abuse. Right? Sudan, whose leader is wanted for genocide by the ICC. Mr. Jazayeri, UN expert, went to Sudan and said the country is a victim of human rights abuses. If Eleanor Roosevelt were alive, would she not agree that, in the words of Reporters Without Borders, many of these decisions are indeed grotesque? Let me conclude my analysis and then just say two words of words of what we can do for reform, and then open the floor if we have time. Is that we're not only celebrating the 10th year of the reform and the 70th year of the founding of the Council, but actually we're celebrating another third anniversary in Geneva. It's 200 years since Percy Bysshe Shelley, the great Romantic poet, and I just saw his house somewhere near Soho 2 days ago, walking here in London. It was 200 years ago that he and his soon-to-be wife, Mary Shelley, went to Geneva in the summer of 1816, together with Lord Byron, and rented a Villa Diodati, on the banks of Lake Geneva, today in the Colonie neighborhood of Geneva, actually overlooking right where the Human Rights Council is today. And famously, that was the year where there was no summer. It was very dark, and there was storms of thunder and lightning. And in those storms, famously, these eminent figures began to share ghost stories. And of course, as you know, Mary Shelley then had a waking nightmare, which she wrote down and became the story of Frankenstein, which takes place in Geneva. The story of an idealist whose creation turned into something that he didn't quite expect. And I often walk past Villa Diodati on those beautiful hills, and when I gaze across Lake Geneva, at the same point where Mary Shelley did that summer, and I see the Human Rights Council, I cannot help but wonder that if the creators, Eleanor Roosevelt and René Cassin, were alive today, would they not behold a sight that is indeed grotesque? And in the words of Mary Shelley, who gazed directly at the site where the Human Rights Council is today before she composed her book, would they not see, Eleanor Roosevelt and Cassin, that their creation has become a fiend, and conclude that the Human Rights Council has become Frankenstein's monster? In conclusion, it is clear that according to the UN's own standards, the promises of the Council's founding resolution, improved membership, action for human rights, an end to politicization, have not been kept. Sadly, every one of Kofi Annan's Criticisms of the old Commission apply equally to the new Council. What can we do to fix things? Briefly, recommendations for the UK and other leading democracies. Number one, they need to oppose the election of violators. Too often they don't say a word. The norm is that the UK, its European allies, and even the US are silent when human rights abusers campaign and get elected. And you know, because I revealed in September, and it was in all your major newspapers, that the UK apparently did what Jon Snow called a horrid deal with Saudi Arabia, where they've agreed to vote for each other. It was in a Saudi WikiLeaks where the Saudis reported that the UK asked Saudi Arabia to vote for itself, and the Saudi wrote to his colleague in Riyadh saying we should ask the UK for a deal that will vote for each other on the Council. The Foreign Office initially didn't comment, but when Jon Snow grilled the Prime Minister, he effectively admitted that the deal happened. By the way, I just read today that Baroness Elie has announced that the UK will run again for renewed membership in 2017, and I saw on the Saudi website that they're also running again for 2017. So here in the House of Lords, I call on Prime Minister Cameron and his government to declare that they will no longer, the next time, do a horrid deal to elect Saudi Arabia onto the Council, nor any other of these regimes. Second, the UK and other democracies should hold abusers to account by introducing resolutions. As I said before, no one even introduced a resolution this year or in the past 10 years on China, Cuba, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Vietnam, and so forth. Third, urgent sessions need to be convened when there is massive human rights abuse. Fourth, the UK and other democracies should promote a narrative that is accurate. When there are good things, and there was something good that just happened a few days ago, they created a new mandate to speak out against violence against LGBT people. And that was a good thing. It just passed. When welcome things happen, we should welcome it. But the report that I read by Baroness Elie on behalf of the Foreign Office was all welcoming all these positive things. And the US Obama administration does the same thing. And I said it in Congress 2 months ago, and I've published it, that if your narrative only talks about positive things, and some of these are exaggerated and some of them are valid, but it doesn't talk about all the terrible things that are happening, then a half-truth is worse than a lie. And you don't make things better by keeping silent on these abuses. Finally, the UK and other democracies should act to eliminate the anti-Israel agenda item. There is one agenda item for the whole world and one agenda item for Israel alone. As I've said, it reminds me of 1984, the dystopian universe imagined by George Orwell, in which the totalitarian regime requires to give its people 2 minutes of hate. And what I saw last week on Monday in Geneva, and I see it every session, whenever there's agenda item 7, the agenda item on Israel, is the day of hate, in which all the inaction of the Council is somehow atoned for, with Israel as a scapegoat. When they release all the moral energy not being used is unleashed against Israel. That I see as the equivalent of the 2 minutes of hate. That has to stop. I want to commend the UK and other Western democracies who were all absent last week. All of them were absent, and around the room, around the table, were only the dictatorships. And I came there just to take the floor and remind them that indeed they were all just dictatorships looking at each other, and to point out the absurdity of that gathering. With that, I conclude.
Thank you for that riveting presentation. We've got 15 minutes for questions, and if a lot of hands go up, then I propose to take 2 or 3 questions at a time. Who would like to kick off?
The gentleman.
Yeah, one there. Anybody else? Well, we've got 2. Okay. We'll have both questions, and then Mr. Neuer can answer. Please say who you are.
My name is Stephen Wright. I'm on the board of Stand With Us and work for Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. I respect the point you made around the UN responding, or the British government responding and not turning up to a recent meeting. However, I've written to MPs on several occasions when resolutions have been made, and Britain has voted for those resolutions, which are very specifically against Israel, and as you rightly said, point to lies, untruths, and all sorts of issues that seem to be one-sided view. what can we do when Britain says, well, the responses I get are that if you think this was bad, the resolution that we've got put down in the first writing was much worse. How does that help me? How does that help this country?
And the other gentleman?
Yeah, you very brilliantly introduced us to the black comedy that is the UN human rights regime. Is this not in itself an indication that the whole attempt to establish an international human rights order of law above the nation state is inherently flawed? What are and what are not human rights are deeply political and subjective questions that can only really be addressed within the context of national communities and states, and that we should just abandon the whole attempt to establish an international system of human rights law.
Wow. There's two big questions for you.
Okay. The first question about the anti-Israel resolutions. Indeed, the UK and other EU countries vote for most of them. I would say out of 5 resolutions introduced annually in Geneva that single out Israel, 4 out of 5 are supported by the UK and its EU allies. In some years, in the past decade, the Netherlands and Italy voted no, and on some rare occasions, the UK and some other countries voted no. But for the most part, they vote for the resolutions introduced by the Arab and Islamic states. So it's quite right that although they were absent last week, and although they have spoken out against the agenda item, they participate in the demonization of Israel by voting for these resolutions. Many excuses are given. One of the excuses which you cited is that, well, it would have been worse if we didn't vote for it. And I think there was one occasion that I'm aware of in my 12 years in the job where Israel may have asked its friends to negotiate with the sponsors of the resolution and, if necessary, to do what's necessary to get a moderated resolution. And it may have happened once, and I think that the government is abusing that one time to justify its votes for the other 60 times when it was not asked and in effect it participates in this demonization. And certainly it's not unique to the Human Rights Council. And the World Health Organization just had its annual meeting, and there was only one country that was singled out as an abuser on health, and it was Israel, which is of course absurd. If you go into any hospital in Israel, and there are problems in Israel and there are problems in the Palestinian territories, and Israel should be held to account, and if its soldiers do bad things, it should be criticized. But on the idea of health, you can go into any hospital in Israel and see hundreds and hundreds of Arabs, including Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank, getting world-class treatment. And there's a reason why thousands of Syrians are fleeing into Israel to get treated by their enemy, Israel, near the Syrian border. And the whole thing is absurd. And you get weird and bizarre excuses. Sometimes you'll get a diplomat saying, well, that particular point was true. And you can always find some point that's true about anything. I gather if I want to criticize the health in this country, I might find a few things too. But to single out Israel in that way is worse than a half-truth. And it's a big lie. If the message of the UN is that Israel is the enemy of the right to health, then you're just encouraging the regimes in that neighborhood and around the world that they can continue doing what they're doing. So this, and the UK voted for it, and we put it on video. It was a roll call vote, and you see the UK saying yes. And no one asked them to vote yes. And you get different excuses which sometimes contradict each other. They are excuses. It's a political business, and it will be a good segue to the second question. The UN is a political body, and countries do political deals. And we saw that we got an effective admission that the UK did a deal with Saudi Arabia. A lot of it is vote trading. The Islamic states have 56 votes. The group of Jewish states has 1 vote. So it's 56-1. So if you want 56 votes, the UK wants to get elected. And you see when they campaigned, the German foreign minister, a number of years ago, 3-4 years ago, addressed an assembly, I think it was from the non-aligned movement, developing countries, and he said, we believe in cooperation. I want you to know. If we'll be elected to the Human Rights Council, our approach will be one of cooperation. The unmistakable message was, don't worry that we're going to condemn any of your governments. Our approach is dialogue and cooperation. And if you want to get elected, that's the message you need to send to unsavory regimes, and you need to make deals to get their 56 votes. So let's be honest about that. And to some extent, Prime Minister Cameron, when he was grilled again and again by Jon Snow, who kept asking him, how did we do this horrid deal? And he tried to divert. He finally said, you want to know why? You want to know why we have a relationship with Saudi Arabia? And it reminded me of that moment in that film with A Few Good Men. You want the truth? And the character played by Jack Nicholson says, of course I ordered the code red. So Prime Minister Cameron says, you want to know why we have a relationship with Saudi Arabia? It's because they give us vital security information and it prevented a bomb going off over the skies of London. And maybe that's true. I cannot judge. But if that is true, you could say that. But I do think that it undermines the credibility of the UK when they are actually voting for these countries. To segue to the other question about is it possible to even have an intergovernmental body that will deal with human rights? That is a fine theoretical question, and indeed we could ask, is it fitting, is it appropriate, is it wise to have diplomats dealing with human rights? Those who represent your countries at these bodies are diplomats. A diplomat is trained to do everything to maintain positive relations with a country. The last thing that diplomats want to do is to condemn other countries. That goes against their nature. So in some sense, I would say it is almost paradoxical to have diplomats be in charge of reviewing other countries' human rights records. We should have independent experts. Who would be the guardians? Who guards the guardians? We come to great theoretical dilemmas that have never been quite resolved. But nevertheless, we do our best to create institutions that inch toward a better society. It's a paradox that we have diplomats doing it, and yet when we gather, our group has the Geneva Summit for Human Rights, and you're all invited once a year in February. UN Watch with 25 other human rights NGOs bring together the most courageous champions of human rights or their families when they're political prisoners, like we had Ensaf Haidar, who's in Canada to speak for her husband Raif Badawi, and this year we had Antonieta Ledesma, whose father, mayor of Caracas, Antonio Ledesma, is in prison, and other eminent figures. It makes more sense to bring victims, it makes more sense to bring experts, but at the end of the day, the world headlines will only be created when an intergovernmental body makes a decision, because that's where the power is. And so we're left with intergovernmental bodies that capture the world's attention, and flawed as they are, they're not going away. The US famously boycotted the Human Rights Council under George W. Bush and Bolton as their UN ambassador. From 2006 to 2009, the US was not absent. And yet the UN Human Rights Council endured, and it will endure. It's there. So whether or not it should be there or not, it's there. And the obligation is upon all of us to make it better. And I'm not sure if we're doing a good enough job in holding our governments to account. And so being here in Parliament, I urge all members of Parliament in all houses to question their envoys about what they're doing.
More questions? Gentleman over there, anybody else? And lady in blue. Yes, please.
Yes, my
Take
name
two
is
questions.
Deech. I'm a deputy in the Board of Deputies of British Jews. First of all, thank you very much for your amazing work. I follow you on Facebook, Mr. Neuer, and I'm very excited about what you do. Question for you, perhaps to be a little bit more positive. I understand that Israel got most recently elected to chair the UN Legal Committee. Is this a first step towards perhaps a more positive view and some kind of inclusion of Israel in the UN framework? Thank you.
And the lady at the back?
My name is from the University of Southampton. I'm interested in what my country is doing in the council. I'm from Japan, and you are aware of, I'm sure you are aware of these human rights abuses happening in Japan against Korean residents in Japan.
Question was asked about a recent vote by the United Nations General Assembly to elect the Israeli ambassador as a chair of the legal committee, and that indeed was a welcome development. It's my understanding that this became possible because Israel was finally admitted into the Western Regional Group, known as WEOG, Western Europe and others, back in the year 2000, and in Geneva into that group in 2014. And by virtue of rotations, many UN positions are effectively rotations within the group, and effectively became Israel's turn. It was the turn of the Western group, and the Western group said, okay, Israel, finally it's your turn. And there was one name on the ballot, kind of like an election in Cuba. Mm-hmm. And many UN votes are like that, and it's basically rotations. And of course, and so the rule is that the Western group picked their person, and the rest of the members just rubber stamp it. That's the norm at the UN. In this case, given that it's Israel, which is never the norm, the Arab and Islamic states were outraged. How dare you elect Israel? And so they mounted a campaign but they had limited success. They got some no votes, but the Israeli was appointed. So it's a welcome thing. I'm not sure if it's indicative of very much, again, because it's a procedure where the UN ambassadors almost automatically, they know that it's something where it's one spot, one name, and it's all been pre-cooked in the back room, and you're just supposed to sign the name, and really only those who were adamantly opposed, and it was a secret ballot as well, to the best of my knowledge. So it's a welcome development, but I'm not sure if it's indicative of much else. Question was asked about Japan. Japan has never been condemned in a resolution. I'm aware of the issue for Koreans. We've been outspoken on the issue of North Korea, certainly, and in that process we've become aware of the issue of Koreans in Japan, and so it's an important issue. It's certainly not something that's been addressed at the UN. I would say North Korea sometimes criticizes Japan for certain things, but human rights issues in Japan are not very much addressed.
Lady here and the lady next to her, those will be the last two. Lady in white.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Neuer. It was a very eye-opening, although I do follow UN Watch. How do you continue to do this work without giving in to the counsel of despair, caught up in all this hypocrisy and cynicism?
Sure.
That's an excellent question. How does one not give in to futility and despair, given all the things that I described? And I would say that I'd say two things. Number one, part of our work, a large part of our work, is bringing human rights victims to testify at the United Nations, and I mentioned a number of them. And in doing that, we meet really some of the most courageous people in the world. And I mentioned Jigme Golog, a Buddhist monk who was beaten horribly for documenting the abuses against his people. And also from China, Yang Jianli, who was in prison for years because of his advocacy for human rights in China. And people that we've met from Cuba and Venezuela and around the world. So that work is very inspiring, and I think even if their regimes are elected, but working with these people is a very inspiring part of our work. And the second part, which is no less encouraging and inspiring, is to see the results of one's work. We know that on many of the issues that I described, if not most, were it not for our work to expose these abuses, it would never see the light of day. So the fact that there were major headlines in this country when Saudi Arabia was elected to chair that committee is only because we saw it buried in a report. The UN did not want the world to talk about it, and we talked about it. And we hope that in the future there'll be less worse members elected. The latest country that got to chair that committee is the regime of al-Sisi in Egypt, which is not as bad as Saudi Arabia, but they did kill 1,000 people in one day, and they did select the expert on executions, on extrajudicial executions, and Egypt was the head of the committee. They chose a woman named Agnes Calamard, who used to work for Amnesty, and I'm sure she's very qualified, although I do note that earlier this year, when we criticized the election of Saudi Arabia, she said, "Oh no, it's just a rotation. You shouldn't criticize that action. It wasn't only a rotation; it was a selection of Saudi Arabia." And 6 months later, after she defended this mechanism, she's been appointed an expert by a committee chaired by Egypt. But we expose these things, and we see them in the Times and in the Guardian and in Le Monde and in CNN and in Al Jazeera, and at times it creates real pressure for action. And if there are any good resolutions, the fact that the Americans are fighting to introduce resolutions for gay rights, or on Eritrea, or on Syria, or in other countries, is partly because they know they have to go to Congress. I spoke at an event like this in Congress, where the administration was grilled by the Congress using our reports. And so scrutiny matters. And we know that our reporting puts the governments, at least the US, maybe not as much the UK, to some degree, we hope more so, under scrutiny, and pushes the diplomats to do some good, and hopefully it'll push them to do more good. So that work is very encouraging, and every day or second day we see truths that we expose to the world, and knowing that we're contributing to adding to that pressure to be a force for good.
And the lady there?
Hello, I'm Marie Verba, and I'd like to know what your organization is was there 4 weeks ago, and there are displaced people. I basically visited an area where 52,000 are there, the victims, Tahura, city, displaced, and they were asking me to reach out because you and Human Rights Office went, I don't know how true, be verified, went there, and until now no help, no assistance, people are dying, children are dying, no schools and everything. So I hope you can take some notice on them. They really need it.
Okay, I'll thank you for your remarks, and duly noted. We certainly spoke out on Libya when the UN was ignoring it, and when Gaddafi's regime was elected again and again to the Human Rights Council, and we brought Libyan victims to testify. Once the UN does address the issue, we focus on other places that are not being addressed. And so in theory, the UN during the war with Libya created a commission of inquiry and was supposed to follow up. And so we haven't done as much work on it as we should, but I'm glad that you mentioned that. And certainly if you know victims or experts who are willing to testify, please have them get in touch with me, and we will be happy to give them the international platform at the UN or at our conferences.
Yeah, because I'll be going there and I want something tangible or whatever I can give an answer to them.
Well, let's be in touch afterwards.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm very glad to hear that our speaker does not get dejected or depressed, because we all admire the work you do so much, and we support the work of UN Watch, and wish you every success and all strength to your elbow. So please join me in thanking and encouraging our very brave speaker for the good work that he does.